Hey, what's up, folks? Thank you all for tuning in to this week's Topicality to Reality live stream. Today, it's just me, but we're talking about the evidence set. I felt like so far we've talked a lot about the topic and things that are really relevant to open debaters that are sort of doing their own research. But I wanted to take today to talk about our evidence set and things that are relevant to our novice and JV debaters that are just getting started with debate, especially now in a digital world where you don't necessarily have had as much practice going into the season. So we'll be talking about the novice evidence specifically, but if you have questions about the JV set when I'm done with my presentation for the novice, we could jump right into that. I've got a presentation for the novice portion of it, not the JV, but I've read it through and through, so I can answer any questions you've got, JV or novice. Also, if you're an open debater tuning in, this will still be relevant to you because you will probably be helping your younger debaters get used to debating and debating online. So I'm sure you will think of questions that your novices won't even think about until after their first round or first tournament. So be sure to let us know in the comments and we'll be sure to get to you. Today is exciting for me because this is actually the first stream that we're doing at both YouTube and Facebook. So whichever one you're tuning in on, thanks for tuning in. With that, I will get started. Cool. So our affirmative packet this year is based off the NDCA novice files. So shout out to NDCA and Noddle and the folks that worked on this file. We've modified it a bit for our league and our divisions. So I'll be talking about the version that we have that isn't exactly the same as the NDCA one. So if you're a non-LAMDL debater, this might not be relevant to you, but for our LAMDL debaters, this is our actual set. Gotta keep myself in frame. The one major thing about it is well, actually, let me just jump into the presentation and you'll see the differences there. All right, so every policy debate that has a plan, the center of that debate is the plan text, right? So the question at the end of the debate, no matter what, is always going to be, should we or should we not pass the plan? This year, the novice's plan text is, the United States federal government should require training on implicit bias in police academies and ongoing state and local departmental trainings as a condition of federal grants. It's a mouthful, but it's like that for a reason. Mainly, this is a quote from the solvency evidence written by an expert on the topic. So this is their exact policy proposal. So let's take a second to break that down and really figure out what that means. First, who's the actor? The United States federal government. Right? Do we know which branch? Not necessarily. But based on the type of action that it says, we could make certain assumptions. So for example, it's about federal grants. So that most likely means this would be some sort of congressional act because Congress is the one that's got the power of the purse. So although the plan doesn't specify it, it most likely would happen through some sort of congressional action. Okay. So the USFG, or the United States federal government, should require training on implicit bias in police academies and ongoing state and local departmental trainings. So when we read into the evidence, it will talk a bit more in detail about what this means and what is implicit bias and how does that training work. But for now, we know that a condition means that the funding would only be given if certain conditions are met or if certain requirements are passed. In this case, a completion of training. Some questions that we might want to ask are, how much are these grants? Which types of grants, right? And is it only grants that the federal government gives to police academies and police trainings, right? Because as you'll see in the evidence on the negative side, money isn't the only thing that the federal government hands down to states and locals, right? What percentage of what the federal government gives is actually tied to money, right? So as you start reading this plan, you want to think about it both from the affirmative and the negative side. On the affirmative, what are some things that what are some answers you'll have to these questions that we're raising? And for the negative, what are some weak spots that we see in this plan text? So as we start going into the general parts of the 1AC, you want to remember that it always comes down to this plan text, that this is the start and this is the end. Okay. Cool. So the affirmative plan has three basic parts. It starts with inherency. For those of y'all that are new to debate and are novices, inherency is a question of what is going on that is preventing this plan from happening in the status quo, and what is going on in the world right now, right? That is causing this problem. According to the 1AC, implicit bias is on the rise due to the pandemic. And if we read the CNEUS evidence, it talks about how senators are currently facing requests from their constituents to pass policies that address this issue. And implicit bias and racial profiling isn't something new, but rather we're seeing a new symptom of it in the way that black folks and people of color are being dealt with by police, right? The quote from the evidence says that in Wood Rivers, Illinois last month, 2 black men wearing surgical masks recording themselves being trailed by a cop who was occasionally gripping his gun in a Walmart store. One of the men said that when the officer approached them, he wrongly told them that there was a national and state order banning the wearing of face masks. And for some context, when you read that in the evidence, it seems absurd. But we actually were able to pull up that video that this card is referring to. So let's take a second to watch that.
Hey, so we were in Walmart and what's this, Wood River? And Wood River, Illinois. This officer right here behind us just followed us in the store. You just video. He said we can't video, but he just told us we're on body cam. He just followed us from outside, told us that we cannot wear masks. There's a presidential order, there's a state order, and he's following us right now to the store. We're being asked to leave for being safe. And this is what we're doing right now. Oh, I'm going to upload this as soon as we leave the store. This is the officer following us out of the store for absolutely no reason. If anybody knows, anybody's watching, the coronavirus is real. This guy is following us. There's more people, but he followed us from outside. From outside, he followed us all the way in the freaking store just to follow us out of the store. That's him.
We're wearing masks.
There he is.
We're getting kicked out of Walmart for wearing masks. Are you serious?
Hey, so coronavirus is real. This police officer just put us out for wearing masks and trying to stay.
Yeah. So this isn't the only instance we're seeing of that. And if we look at the inherency evidence in the 1AC, it points to a few other instances where it's happening too. And I'm sure as you've been following the news, you could come up and point to other examples of these kinds of instances where black people and people of color are being targeted by police because of things that they're suspected of being, right? The specific quote that the evidence points to is how the officer followed the men because he believed they were acting suspicious. Am I in frame? Yeah, suspicious, right? And what is it about them being suspicious outside of living while black, right? So this is what the affirmative case tries to address, these sorts of implicit biases that exist within police departments and how they interact with folks in the community, right? So one quote that I think is important to highlight here, right, is that this isn't something new. The evidence says that the police targeting of black men is a long-standing American tradition, one that naturally incited antagonism and black distrust of law enforcement. This relationship, molded by decades of unequal treatment, as seen through traffic stops, wrongful arrests, officer-involved shootings, surveillance, stop and frisk, incarceration, and much more could prove even deadlier for black people at a time of widespread social fragility. So now that we've set the stage, right, we want to sort of dig a little bit deeper in that. The second part of the 1AC and the second part of the story is the harms. What does this do to our communities, and what does this do to people that have to interact with these police? The primary impact that our 1AC talks about is over-policing. And it says that police-community relations are directly linked to the over-policing that occurs due to implicit bias. And it points to specific evidence and data that highlights this, right? That when police policies and police practices are shaped by these sorts of assumptions and racist assumptions, right, that leads to folks getting over-policed. And when you're over-policed, or you're someone who's innocent and then treated as if you did something, right, you have to think about how does that impact the community overall. Right? And the ultimate impact there in the 1AC is that these relations lead to a disproportionate application of force. Right? And that when we think about the relationship between police and people of color and our communities, right, in what ways do the policies that exist reinforce this divide? Right? And is there a way to address some of the symptoms of these deeper issues through policy? According to the affirmative, there is. Right? And that's where we get to the solvency, that by training police officers on their implicit bias and forcing police and police academies to turn it into a policy, that would create change in some instances. Right? That conditioning the funding is effective as long as it's uniform across the states. Right? When we get to the negative, we'll talk about an argument, the state's counterplan, that says that it's better for different states to address the problem on their own. But the 1AC already preempts that, or in other words, makes an argument assuming what the negative will say. So it says that it's better for this to be uniform, right? You could point, the classic example of federal conditioning is the drinking age, that the federal government pulled back funding for road repairs and things like that when states chose to have a different drinking age. So even though the states have the option to have their own drinking age, they decided to be uniform in it because it was conditioned on federal funding. So historically, and the evidence points to other examples and why specifically in the case of police training and police funding, why it's effective there. But historically, if money is involved, that's how you get local things to change from the top down. So that's the most simple version of the 1AC, right? And when you think about the 1AC, it's sort of telling a story. It's not the final version of the story, but it's what's initially laid out. For our novice, you start here. For our JV, you have an additional affirmative that you could choose that centers around defunding the police. And you could also choose this one. So you get to choose between either affirmative if you're in JV. But novice, you only get the implicit bias training affirmative. I almost asked if anyone has questions, but feel free to put them in the chat. I'll answer them there. I'm just used to doing this kind of talk in person, but we live and we learn. Cool. So we know what the 1AC looks like, and it's a pretty straightforward story, right? It just says that there are issues in police departments and the way that police work in the United States, and that it's really just a matter of training. And if we train folks, it might not get rid of racism, obviously, but it could potentially reduce incidences such as the one in the video that we showed before, right? That ones that are rooted in implicit bias as opposed to actual actions of folks that are being policed. So most folks have an easy time understanding the 1AC, but then what happens after that? What happens in the rest of the debate? So for the affirmative, you have a lot of options in the 2AC. If we think back to the structure of a policy debate round, the 1NC is the first negative speech. It happens after the 1AC. The 2AC is the affirmative second chance to speak. So in the 2AC, you have a chance to extend the arguments that you established in the 1AC, but you also have the opportunity to add new arguments. So the first thing is an add-on. So this is an additional advantage that you could use in the 2AC to leverage against negative arguments established in the 1NC. And in simplest terms, this add-on says that over-policing isn't the only advantage, but included in that is the fact that when police are not trained on implicit bias and when there is police violence, this increases the risk of vigilantes in the community, right? That when people can't trust the police, this is what leads to people taking the law into their own hands. The evidence points to instances of this in both directions, where folks don't trust the police because they've been a victim of police abuse in their community, but also on the other end, where people think that when things like protests and riots occur, that the police are unjustly being targeted. So there are vigilantes that go out to defend the police, right? And we've seen the tragic shootings that occurred as a result of that, right? So when police misconduct occurs, we see the risk of vigilantes in different scenarios, right? Whether that's folks trying to defend themselves from violence or folks that perceive police as under attack, trying to defend the police, right? And in general, that is a symptom of a lack of accountability of those kind of folks in power. So if we could do something, if we could pass some sort of policy to help address this issue, that would reduce. After add-ons, you have the option of extensions. So this is just additional evidence that supports the claims of the 1AC. I'll talk about this in a moment, but you don't need to use all of the evidence in the packet. You don't need to use all of the extensions in the packet. Rather, the extensions are there to help support and build up arguments that you've already made. So you don't always, sometimes the 1AC has enough evidence already established and read, right? It's a strong enough claim, it's a strong enough warrant that you could use to compare. Ultimately, in debates, and we see this a lot, that novice, when they go into their first debates, aren't sure what to do, so a lot of the time they just are sort of reading cards. And that's fine. You could do that. But when we start thinking strategically about it, it's much more powerful and persuasive for you to make your own articulation and examples from the evidence that you already read in the 1AC. So sometimes those extensions are necessary, right? Because the negative will make arguments that your 1AC didn't take into account. So then you could add some extensions. But don't think that just because you have a lot of evidence, you need to use all of the evidence. It's better to highlight the most important parts of it, right? Less is more. Third, the other things that you have in your arsenal for the 2AC is answers to turns. So a couple of the turns that the negative gets to make, we'll talk about in a moment. But it's a question of how this training affects how police work, right? One of the negative claims is that police burn out from too much training and overthinking, that when they have to consider all the different rules in place with policing, that they just don't want to be police anymore. And we don't want that, according to the negative. And second, that it just makes the job more difficult, right? That when you have all these rules and they have to keep all these rules in mind, it makes them worse at their jobs because it's not straightforward. So the 2AC has built-in answers to sort of answer some of those things. The last thing that I have to say on the 2AC evidence and answers, you are allowed to make your own arguments on top of this, right? While the evidence set is limited, you're still allowed to make analytical arguments or point to things in the news or other examples of things going on in the world that are relevant to the topic. Especially when it comes to criminal justice, this evidence pack is only a small sliver of the actual national discussion going on, right? And it should only be seen as a springboard towards deeper, more fruitful discussions that you would lead in your debates. So don't be afraid to do more or to make other arguments if you feel strongly about it or more comfortable with it. there's also answers to the other negative off-case arguments, but I'll discuss that when I talk about the off-case arguments. Okay. So that's the affirmative. That's one side of the debate. But the other side is the negative, right? And in in debate tournaments, you debate both sides of the topic. At a traditional LAMDL tournament, you have 4 debates. 2 of them are on the affirmative, 2 of them are on the negative. So you'll need to know both sides of the debate and of the topic. You'll need to know the strengths of the evidence packs and the arguments, as well as the weaknesses of them, because on one side of the debate, you'll be defending it. On the other side, you'll be attacking it. Okay. So the negative side, real fun side of the debate, you've got options, right? So it's up to you how you execute these debates. So even though there is a limited evidence set, right, one of the things that we want you to learn as novice is how to think strategically about how these arguments interact with each other, and to start thinking about the big picture of how arguments work in conjunction with each other. Right? So the way that I'm going to approach the negative is based on strategies that you can execute. Okay? Ignore the text on this slide. So you generally have 3 2-and-R options. These aren't the only ways that you can mix and match these arguments, but the way the file is designed is based around these 3 potential outcomes in the debate. You could throw all of these out there in the 1NC, but by the 2-and-R, you're most likely going to select one of these 3 strategies. The first strategy is the elections disadvantage with case turns. So the elections disadvantage has 3 main parts. First is the uniqueness. So what's going on in the world right now, and how is the election going? Right? So the elections disad makes a claim that Biden is going to win the election right now, that Trump is doing so poorly that it's clear that Biden's going to win, but it's still competitive, right? That despite the how well Biden is doing, a lot of Trump's base is unwilling to move, right? That a lot of the base that made Trump win in 2016 are going to return to help him win the election again in 2020, right? So even though Biden's winning now, it's still possible to lose. So what does that mean for things like the affirmative and other types of criminal justice reform? Well, according to the negative, if we do these types of reforms, at least before the election, that this puts folks that are in the center or in swing states in favor of Trump, right? Because it makes him seem like a more reasonable candidate for the folks that have been disappointed with him in the last 4 years, right? And this might seem irrational, but a lot of the times when you look at the data and election results, that the things that a lot of people vote on isn't necessarily a breadth of policies, right? That there is a recency bias when it comes to going to the polls. So even if a president was terrible for 4 years, what we see is that what's most important is what's fresh in people's minds the few months before the election. So even if it seems irrational, this argument actually does have some grounding in reality, that for large portions of the voting base, they can be swung in either direction by particular things that happen very close to the election. Okay. So in a world where criminal justice reform passes and Trump is reelected, this would lead to Trump being reelected because a lot of those centrists move over and vote for Trump, according to this dissent. Okay? And in the packet, you have a lot of scenarios where that discuss why a Trump reelection would be bad. So there's 3 main ones, but you get to choose which impact scenario you think is most important. So one of them is about retrenchment, which is just like expanding military conflicts. There's also the risk of climate change with 4 more years of Trump. And there's also a case turn where these sorts of racial issues only get worse, right? Because this one policy would pass, but then that gives the green light to roll them back or make it worse over the course of what would be Trump's second term. Okay. So you make that argument, and there are also case arguments. So the case turns that I mentioned earlier, the ones that say that implicit bias makes it harder for police to work, but also case defense arguments that are arguments that say the plan doesn't really solve the problem, right? That it doesn't address the root cause, and that training would be circumvented, or in other words, that police would find a way to do the training and get the money without really doing the training and changing what they do, right? All those case arguments are going to be very strong because there's a lot of evidence about other times that we've tried these reforms that didn't really fix the problem overall, right? So then at that point, the debate is it worth trying even if it only affects a small percentage, right? Does every step count, or is it not worth it, and is it better to try to do it in a different way? Okay? Different questions that you have to ask yourself as the negative, and things that you want to take into consideration about the judge's perspective on the arguments in the round. Cool. Second option that the negative has is the federalism disadvantage and the state's counterplan. So what is federalism? Federalism is about the balance between state power and federal power on issues that are in one of their jurisdictions or the other. And so according to the federalism disadvantage, and as we learned last week, criminal justice is a power generally designated to the states and local authorities, right? That when we think of police, it's a city thing, it's a state thing, right? When you think of sheriffs, when you think of police. But when the federal government takes an action like the plan and oversteps their authority, right, that this shifts the balance away from states, right? That this takes away the state's authority and jurisdiction and their right to govern independently when it comes to law enforcement and criminal activity. So when that happens, according to the disad, this also hurts states' ability to act independently on other issues such as COVID. Right? When you read the evidence, this seems like a bit of a stretch, but the evidence points to a lot of areas where Trump has sort of acted on purpose to work against the states and their efforts to control COVID's spread in their local areas, right? So what happens in a world where Trump continues to overstep the federal government's authority on issues, right? And how does that impact places where he's already done that, right? According to the evidence, that federalism overall would be hurt by federal overstepping on criminal justice issues, but also public health concerns. So if the federal government is willing to overstep things on criminal justice, they're also willing to overstep on other things that are traditionally state issues, right? And that ultimately the goal here is to prove to the judge that this world is worse than that of the affirmative, right? That when the affirmative passes the plan, that we don't really think about the consequences. Okay? And third, you have the option of going for T, or topicality. Okay? Topicality is a stock issue that simply says that the affirmative is off topic, and regardless if you think the AF is a good or bad idea, you need to reject it on face because it's off topic and doesn't actually fall under the resolution. The topicality definition in the file defines the word policing from the resolution as the use of state power for law enforcement. So this means that things like training and funding aren't really topical because that's not specifically about the law or how it gets enforced, right? That because no laws really change or like practices are implemented or the way that there's nothing really changed about how it's enforced, only how police are trained, that it's not really criminal justice reform in policing, right? Rather, that's a reform in funding. That's a reform in training, right? That distinction is important, right? Because that opens up the debate to be much wider than simply policing, right? That includes other types of things such as funding for non-policing efforts that police do, right? So community efforts, right? So as you probably know, you could think of other things that police do besides patrolling the streets, right? So this would expand affirmatives to include everything that police do in their community. And that would be a very difficult debate to prepare for. So we shouldn't justify affirmatives that do that. So while these three are options that you have, you could always mix and match these things, right? You could go for the state's counterplan and the federalism disadvantage and the elections dissent together. You could go for case turns with the state's counterplan. You could go for, well, I would generally recommend going for topicality by itself, but if you feel comfortable or need something to fall back on, you could go for case arguments and topicality arguments, right? You have a lot of options there. So feel free to mix and match these. These are just designed to fit this way. But it's up to you. And that's the fun part of debate, that you get to sort of decide how these pieces work together, where they go. And based on how your opponent reacts to you and the different schools that you compete against, the way the debate goes down goes differently. So even though there is a limited evidence set, every debate is going to be different. All right. So before I moved on, I wanted to sort of address three common negative mistakes that we see happen with novices. First is, as I've sort of mentioned throughout this presentation, is that less is more, right? That you should kick arguments, right? That at the beginning of the debate, you could have all of these things in the one NC. It depends on how fast you read it, right? But theoretically, you could have two disadvantages, a counterplan, case defense and solvency takeouts, and case turns, and a topicality, right? But by the end of the debate, you want to narrow that down, right? Because at the beginning, you have the whole debate to open up those arguments, to sort of talk about them, right? But by the end of the debate, you want to narrow it down, right? That you want to do less, right? If you want a good example of this, go check out the demo debate that we have on our channel from summer camp, right? That in that debate, the negative started with three or four significant arguments, right? But by the end of the debate, they went for one or two important points that ultimately, and that was ultimately more impactful, right? That when it comes to the goal of the debate, right, we want you to learn how to be persuasive, right? And having a lot of points isn't necessarily more persuasive than having a few well-developed ones. So be willing to kick more arguments. Okay. This also applies to how much evidence you're reading, right? That we see this a lot with novices, that they'll lean on reading extensions and things like that. But as I mentioned when we were talking about the affirmative, this applies to the negative too. That just because you have extra evidence to read doesn't mean you need to use all of it, right? You only need to use whatever's relevant to the debate itself, right? So this is just a general example, but let's say they read just the state's counterplan and the federalism disadvantage. You don't need to answer the elections disadvantage because it wasn't in the debate. If you're negative, and they don't read the vigilante add-on, you don't need to answer that later in the debate. And even within that, right, if the evidence that you've already presented answers the claims that you're reading new evidence for, right, it's better to be comparative and better to put your own spin and articulation on the argument, right? It's more persuasive for the judge, and it'll help your speaker points significantly, right? The debaters that tend to do better are the ones that later in the debate are reading less and talking more, right? The reason that we have a closed evidence set is because we don't want you to be bogged down in doing research until you know how to argue, right? That the first steps in becoming a debater is learning how to argue. So this means learning how to speak up, learning how to make strategic choices, learning how to use evidence, not just read it, right? Because you could have a million cards, but that isn't going to win you a debate. You could win whole debates with just one or two cards, right? And oftentimes, the most competitive debates come down to just one or two cards, even when they start in a wider set of arguments, right? When you end up in open, right? And I'm sure a lot of your older debaters could talk about debates that they've had like this, right? You'll have a 1NC that has like 8 different off-case arguments, but then by the end of the debate, they end up going for just one of them, right? Or just 2 of them. So less is always more. Second, be careful with contradictions, but it's not the end of the world. What I mean by this is what I've seen a lot is like negatives get flustered when an affirmative calls them out for having contradicting points, right? So, for example, if you make a case solvency takeout argument that says implicit bias training doesn't work, right? But then 2AC gets up and says, gotcha, right? You said implicit bias training doesn't work, but you're trying to do implicit bias training on the state level. So that means that implicit bias training doesn't work on the state level either, which means your counterplan goes away, which means you lose, right? So I've seen that happen. And that's a fine argument to make if you're the affirmative. But if you're in the negative, that could be a blow to your ego, right? It'll get you shooken a little bit, right? Maybe the counterplan isn't that great, right? Thinking these kind of negative thoughts to yourself. But don't worry. It's not the end of the world. You've got the whole debate, right? And the debate's not over until it's over. I can't tell you how many times we've seen debates or I've judged debates where it comes down to what's in the 2NR and the 2ER. And you'll have a debate where it seems like the 1AR made a mistake and dropped something, but then the 2NR doesn't capitalize on it, and the 2AR is able to save the day, right? Nobody knows who won the debate until the debate's over. So even if the affirmative calls you out on having contradicting arguments, it's okay. You could address it, concede it, and move on, right? Not only is it allowed to do that, right? But the negative is designed to do that, right? That it's your goal just to address the affirmative, right? Or the burden of rejoinder. It's your burden to respond to the affirmative in whatever way, and whatever combination of arguments you have, right? That's the fun part of being negative. You're not really tied to the arguments that you start with, that you can make strategic choices to get rid of some arguments based on affirmative responses. So if they say there's a contradiction, you don't need to go for both. So don't be afraid if the affirmative calls you out for that. Okay. On the inverse, though, if you're affirmative and you want to capitalize on that, right, it's not enough just to say that there's a contradiction there, right? You want to say what that means for the big picture, right? How does that impact these arguments, right? And based on negative choices, how can that contradiction still be used to your advantage? Okay. So for both the affirmative and both the negative, you want to think big picture. And when I say thinking big picture, what I mean by that is, how do these arguments interact with each other on the top level, right? What is the ultimate story being told by both sides of the debate, right? Because for different judges, regardless of what their experience is, right, debate is a persuasive activity, right? Debate is about how well you articulate your points, right? So whoever controls that controls the debate, and smaller, meticulous technicalities in terms of contradictions and arguments that you're running are less important than the overall thrust of who's more persuasive. And this is especially true for novice and JV debate. Right? Finally, you want to split the block, right? If we go back to the arguments that the negative has, there is a lot of options for what you have here. So the 2NC and the 1NR should take different arguments throughout the debate, or in the block rather. And you shouldn't repeat yourself on that. That the negative should put some of the arguments in the 2NC and some of the arguments in the 1NR. And there's different ways to do that. Okay? Maybe what you do is have the 2NC cover one of these 2NR strategies, right? They cover the elections decided on the case. And then you have the 1NR cover federalism and states. And then based on how the 1AR answers those arguments, choose if you go for the elections decided and case, or the federalism decided and the states counterplan. Okay. Alternatively, you could read all of these arguments in the 1NC and then kick them at the beginning of the block, and then just go in on one of these options very early, or during the block rather. Right? So you could have the 2NC go for just 8 minutes of the state's counterplan, and the 1NR 5 minutes on the federalism dissent. Right? It really depends on what you think is strategically strongest for you. And that decision should be informed by what the 2AC says, right? Let's say the 2AC completely drops the state's counterplan by accident, and you want to take advantage of that, right? Maybe you just want to go all in on that, right? But it's up to you to sort of make that strategic choice. It's one of those things that's high risk, high reward, right? It's high risk to narrow down your debates earlier in the debate, right? Because then the affirmative has less to answer, but it's also high reward, right? You have more time to develop your offense, right? This is why when you get to more advanced stages of the debate, you'll see teams that are from the beginning of the debate, one off, only the K, or one off, just framework, right? Usually framework and something else, but that go for less arguments, right? Because as I've already mentioned, less is more. So the sooner you narrow down arguments, the better, right? But how you execute that is up to you. And every debate round's a fresh start. So I encourage you to experiment, try different strategies, split the block differently, right? In one tournament, you'll get 2 chances at each side of the debate, right? So maybe in your first negative debate, you split the block by having the 2NC go for Federalism and the Counterplan and have the 1NR go for T, right? And then the 2NR chooses between those. Maybe you lose that debate. It's okay. You've got another negative debate where you could try the same strategy but go for the other 2NR option. Or you could scrap that whole strategy together and just go for one of them at the beginning of the block. It's really up to you and how you want to move the pieces and how the affirmative reacts to you. Okay. Cool. So whatever you do, you just want to make sure that the 2NC and the 1NR are covering different arguments, because it doesn't help to repeat yourself. It does help to go more in depth with your arguments. Cool. So that's the negative. What side do you prefer? Do you prefer being affirmative? Do you prefer being negative? Right? Does it depend on which case it is and which case you're debating against? Right? Let us know in the comments. Right? We're checking those out. If you have any questions, we're here and open to answer them. Right? Cool. But that's the main points that I've got there. There's a little bit of a delay on the stream, so I'm going to give folks a few seconds to catch up and type anything in the comments that they might have. But thank you all for tuning in. It's been exciting to have this, and we have another tournament. We have our first tournament coming up in a few weeks, so I hope to help y'all out in getting ready for that. Cool. Actually, it looks like we do have some comments. Let me pull them up. Cool. All right, so the first question I've got is, someone asked, what happens after the plan is passed? Yeah, because that's always something that's asked in cross-X, right? And you'll see that a lot with this affirmative in the Novice specifically, where when it comes to implicit bias training, right, does that get rid of all of racism? No, definitely not, right? And as the affirmative, you probably don't want to have to deal with that. But the better way to sort of address that is, right, to sort of lean back on what your solvency authors talk about there, right? So when the plan passes, obviously there's going to be some sort of like period where the plan happens, right? But the goal of the debate is, what is the best policy option, and is it good to implement that, right? So regardless of how long it takes to sort of change funding and do all the specific nitty-gritty parts of the plan, right, it's ultimately a question about what is the best and most ethical sort of policy option. Cool. shout out to ELC. We got Coach Hal in the comments, and we've got Jorge Aguilar. Jorge's question is, hey Joseph, I'm a debater from ELC, and I'm curious to know, how could a novice address a dropped argument from the opponent's side in order to win the debate? Cool. So this is definitely something that you want to take advantage of, but it really depends on what that argument is. Sometimes the dropped argument will be important for one flow in the debate, but not necessarily the debate overall. But that really depends on your spin and how you take advantage of that dropped argument. So the biggest thing is you want to point out why that small argument is more important for the debate overall. Right? So let's say, for example, the dropped argument is a turn. Right? It's very clear why a turn would be important, right? Because when an argument is turned, that means you take away your opponent's offense, right? And you get to use it for yourself, right? That you get to weigh that against them. That the thing that they're saying they win the debate for, when they actually make that worse, it's up to you to articulate to the judge why that's a problem, right? So one of the turns that the negative has against the affirmative is that, yeah, by adding more training, this leads to more police burnout, right? Which leads to more crime and more harms, right? So really what it means is that the way you would do it depends on the argument itself. And where it's happening in the debate. But in every scenario, that one argument, you need to explain why it matters for the debate overall. And even if it's something small, like a defensive argument that says that implicit bias training isn't enough, right? Let's say that the 2AC drops that argument, right? Let's say you only spent 30 seconds on that in the 2AC, right? You could blow that up later in the debate, right? As a round ending argument, right? If the plan doesn't do anything to fix the problem, right, that could be game over for the AF, right? So it really depends on what the argument is and how you tie it to the ultimate question of the debate, which is, do we pass the plan or not? Right? So why does that dropped argument mean we pass the plan or we don't? Thank you for the question, Jorge. Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Shout out to Dr. Yaneda from Harbor Teach Prep. Glad you're enjoying the information presented. I hope it's helpful for your students. Oh, what's this? I have this layered a little bit wrong.
Just more questions.
Okay. Oh, looks like we've got some more questions. So Lillian from Bravo asks, what's the best method for novice and JV debaters to write their blocks? This is a really good question. And I think this is one place where folks like you, Lillian, can help your novice debaters deal with these things, right? Because the evidence packets, even though they're not super long, there is a lot to read and get through, right? You can help them sort of figure out what the most important arguments are. But they should use the same sorts of block outlines that you usually use for answering disads, right? So, or answering counterplans like TULIP and things like that. So the best method is to use those traditional formulas. And right now, I'm not sure if we have a video on this yet, but if sort of overview on block writing is something that you're interested in, let us know and we'll do a video on it. Alternatively, check out our camp videos on the specific arguments. So our disadvantage video, the counterplan video, the T video, because those talk about types of arguments that you can make as responses in the 2AC. Yeah. Cool. So this is an important question, also from the Instagram. They asked, how long should the 1AC be during practice in the speech? I always have over a minute left. Yeah, so the novice packs are built to be kind of small just so it's easier to digest and get used to things. So if you feel yourself having extra time, don't be afraid to slow down and don't be afraid to sort of explain arguments in between, right? That especially in novice, the persuasive aspect and the speech aspect of your debate is going to be very important. And this is especially true for online debates, right? Where we can't really control how well your judge hears you, or the environment that your judge is in, or the environment that you're in, right? So going slower is always going to be helpful. So feel free to take pauses, feel free to slow down a bit. And if you still have time after that, even after doing that, and even after adding some of your own examples and explanations, don't be afraid to waive the time, right? If you think you've built the case up and you've established it, again, as I emphasized earlier, less is more, right? So it's better to make one strong argument than it is to sort of become repetitious, just because it reduces the impact that you have, right? This is a weakness for me. When I talk, I tend to ramble, and even after I've made my point, I tend to overemphasize it. So even experienced debaters tend to do that. So don't be afraid to sit down and end it when it's done. Cool. All right. Looks like I've got another one. Okay, so some procedural questions about how things work in LAMDL. Is everything in the evidence set debatable? Yeah, everything in the evidence set is debatable, right? None of these things are solid or absolutely true facts, right? That it's up to you to decide which arguments you think are strong and which ones aren't for the side of the debate that you're on. Can we retag evidence? In Novice and JV, no. That being said, you could add other analytics before and after evidence that you read. So the things that you would write as a new tag, you could still read and write those. You still have to use the tag in the evidence set, because we don't want evidence being the intention or the interpretation of the evidence being changed. Okay. Priscilla asks, would ending up with less arguments at the end of the debate count as dropping arguments to the opposing team? So it would be conceding arguments, but sometimes conceding arguments is strategic, right? Sometimes you want to drop arguments in order to better emphasize the ones that you're going for, right? When you drop arguments, it's not always going to be a round ender, right? It's not always going to be something that is something for you to lose, right? So for example, if you are reading the elections disadvantage and the 2AC says that, well, the election is too close and this one plan is not enough to shift voters, right? That's a defensive argument. That's a no link argument that says that the plan is not enough to change the election. If you concede that argument, that doesn't hurt you as the affirmative, right? Or yeah, that doesn't hurt you as the negative, rather. All that means is the disad goes away. But the disad going away is not a reason for you to lose the debate, right? The reason that you would lose the debate is when the affirmative proves that the plan is a good idea, right? The affirmative proving that the disadvantage isn't necessarily true doesn't win them the debate. That's not their burden. Their burden is to prove that the plan is necessary and better than any competing policy option that you've presented on the negative. But that's a good question. Okay. Ureni asks, I was wondering what tips you can give new debaters or what things we can use while debating. One, I would say have fun with it. We're all in a new world with this online debating and figuring it out. So if you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed about it, don't worry. You're all here to learn it, and you're only going to be competing against other novice and new debaters that are also learning this stuff with you. So there will be things and faux pas where you do something that is embarrassing in the moment, but it's something that you're going to be laughing on later in the debate, right? I know when I was novice and I was just first getting a packet, I had the whole packet put in front of me and I was told, go debate. And there were definitely debates where I just started reading evidence and it was the wrong evidence, or it was from the other side of the debate, and I didn't realize that until after I was reading it. And those things happen. So my advice there is just go with the flow, learn from your mistakes, have fun with it. In terms of strategies for winning debates or doing that kind of stuff, the best thing you could do is know your 1AC and your 1NC and lean on it, right? That, as I've been trying to emphasize, less is more, and being able to articulate yourself in your speeches beyond reading the evidence really highlights your expertise in it. So the better you know that evidence and the easier that you can point to those authors and be able to say that stuff, it will just be more impressive for your judges, right? Because it shows that you have a better understanding of your arguments. And at the end of the day, judges want to vote for people that know their arguments. Okay, so the best thing you could do is know the 1AC, know the 1NC, know your authors, know the warrants. Cross-Ex is one of those places where you could highlight this best, right? That in Cross-Ex, it's the one place in the debate where time is flexible, right? Every other speech in the debate is a set time for a set side of the debate, but Cross-Ex is the one place where you get to directly clash with your opponent. And it's the one place where that is most impactful for the perception of the debate, right? Because it's the only place that you get to directly clash with your opponent. If you get up in Cross-Ex and you're asking specific questions that traps your opponent, right? Or that are very specific, right? That highlights your knowledge of the debate, that will improve your chances of winning the debate and definitely improve your speaker points, right? Because expertise is one of those things that judges are looking for. And that's not just about asking questions, it's also about when you're answering the questions, right? If you're able to give deep, descriptive answers to questions that are being asked of you, judges tend to be more persuaded by that, right? So Cross-Ex is one of the places where you could get an early start in terms of controlling the perception of the debate and how the judge feels about which side they're leaning towards, right? Because generally, the evidence set is designed to be balanced, right? That the affirmative will win about half the debates, the negative will win about half the debates, right? What makes the difference isn't the arguments in the debate. It's about how well you present the arguments and how persuasive you are, right? But what makes the argument persuasive isn't just that the author is on the page, but it's about you and how you speak and your style, and just figuring out what you think works best for you. So yeah, that's one of those things that you ultimately develop over time with practice, right? That as novice, you're just trying to get the nuts and bolts down, that it's just like, okay, what are the speech orders? What's the order? When am I supposed to read what? Right? And debate feels very mechanical. But once you have that part down, that's where you get to have fun with it, and you get to sort of find your style. You get to do all the things that get to learn the persuasive aspect of it, right? And adapting to your judge. Okay. Cool. Let me check if I have anything else. While I'm pulling these up, just want to let y'all know it's been really fun sort of having these talks with y'all. We've got 2 more for this series, but we are open for suggestions for new ones in the future. So if there are other things that y'all want us to talk about, or other folks that you'd want to hear from, let us know, because I'm having a lot of fun with it. So there we go. While I'm pulling this out, I wanted to say shout out to our followers that are new. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on those notifications so you always know when we're going live. Okay? Shout out to all the folks finding us on Facebook. This is the first time that our stream has been connected to Facebook. So if you already like our page and you see me now, drop a comment, drop a like, do whatever. Thank you, thank you. Cool. And then looks like I've got one more question, and I think that'll be it for today. But someone asks about 2AC rereading the 1AC or parts of the 1AC verbatim. Yeah, that's definitely something that you see a lot of, is debaters rereading evidence as opposed to explaining it, right? You don't need to reread evidence, right? The judge heard it the first time. So instead, it's better for you to sort of articulate it and put spin on it, and put your own stories in there, right? And this will be especially true on this year's topic because we all have experiences with police. We all have experiences with, we all have experiences with police, right? So you want to find yourself in that debate. So if speaking about that is something that interests you, make sure you tune in next week, because Brenda Montez will be talking about how to do that in debate, right? Because a lot of the times on other topics, in this topic, it'll happen also, but you'll feel yourself divorced a bit from the topic, that it just seems like you're making arguments that aren't necessarily true to yourself, right? A lot of the times when you're first getting introduced to debate, you're told you'll debate both sides of it, whether you agree with it or not, right? So next week, when we're talking with Brenda, we'll be talking about how do you put yourself in the debate, right? And how do you use that to empower yourself, not just in debate, but outside of debate, right? Sometimes this takes the form of critical arguments and critical affirmatives. Sometimes this takes the form of personal stories within policy affirmatives, right? It really depends. But if that's something that interests you, tune in next week. We'll be talking more about that. Yeah. And one other question about cross-ex was, how do you deal with an opponent that won't ask you a question, but instead just tries to make arguments, right? So that one is common as well. You'll see a lot of folks, instead of asking a question, making an argument. So if you're the one being asked a statement, I guess that's the best way to phrase it, just ask them, like, what is your question? And then try to force them to do that, right? Because you don't want to get into this bickering back and forth with the other team in cross-ex, because at least from the judge's perspective, that could be a bit frustrating just to try to parse and deal with, right? That instead of engaging, you want to sort of redirect into having them ask a question, right? If you're the person just sort of making a statement, right? Let's say the other team tries to get away with something that's just, you have your speech to do that, right? Don't be afraid to take note of comments made in cross-ex and bring them up in your speech, right? That the judge isn't going to forget about it, right? The judge is listening, the judge is flowing, right? So feel free to highlight that stuff during your speech. But during cross-ex, the way you stay in control when you're asking questions, right? When you're the cross-examiner, right? Is to continue to ask questions, even if you don't like their answer, right? Because the other team is never going to give you an answer that you want unless you set them up for it, right? And that's just something that takes a lot of learning to do. Cool. Want to make sure to give everyone their shout outs and their follows over, oh, wrong side, over there. Yeah. Cool. But that's all I had. Feel free to continue to shoot questions to the staff on the LAMDL Instagram, right? That'll still be open and the comments are still there. And any questions that you have, other folks probably have. So we'll be sure to share answers to that there. Aside from that, good luck to the folks competing at Jack Howe this weekend. That's going to be a fun tournament, also all online. So if you're competing at that, good luck. For those of y'all that are not competing until T1, we've got 2 more episodes of the Topicality Reality. Tune in next week with Brenda Montez, where we'll be talking about self-empowerment and putting yourself in the debate space. Aside from that, thank you all, and have a good night.